Hello everyone and welcome to this video dedicated to measuring what matters to guide thinking and action, in other words, development indicators. So this video is part of a set of courses split into two parts, the problem space and the solution space. If you haven't seen the first part and the introduction to this solution space, I suggest you do so because it will be much easier to fully understand this part, which will be dedicated to the various different indicators and how we can modify them in detail to better address the question that interests us. How do we develop sustainable prosperity, and how do we move away from or at least modify the current economic paradigm that is focused on measuring economic activity, which is important but not the be-all and end-all of the solutions we need to achieve. So for that, the video is in two parts. The second part will be dedicated to how we can evaluate the decoupling of economic activity from the resources it uses and the environmental impacts it generates. So how do we measure this? How can we manage this action? This will be covered in the second part later. Right now, I want to discuss coupling, ways to decouple, and evaluate the differences between prosperity and economic activity. It's a topic that is less discussed, yet it is very important. It was the subject of a book that gained significant attention when it was released in 2009, Prosperity Without Growth, a report by Tim Jackson for the UK Sustainable Development Commission. It has since been revised, published in French, and questions, as an economist, how our societies could evolve with economic activity that no longer increases, but on which we would collectively rely. We would focus on how to develop a form of prosperity. So for that, we need to make a number of definitions, and first of all, let me tell you that this is something very common, or at least a very debated topic, and it's almost a cliché to say that we need to stop measuring the quality of development with GDP. This has been said for decades, including by influential economic actors over the years. I have chosen the World Economic Forum, the OECD, and the European Union among some references for you. There is a consensus that GDP is not suitable. On the other hand, there is currently no consensus at all on the best way to replace it, let alone amend or complement it. And that's what we're indeed going to look at now. So, what are we talking about? I have taken this definition of prosperity, which is indeed as good as any other, but it has an interesting aspect. Wealth, growth, ease, favorable situation, state of abundance, well-being, comfort, happiness, etc. In this definition, two things are associated, wealth and happiness. And this is really, indeed, the heart of the matter if we actually want to ask this particular question, because what is the link between material wealth and happiness? And by wealth I mean material wealth. If we want to dematerialize or reduce our dependence on material and energy, this is indeed the question we are asking. What exactly is the relationship between wealth and happiness, and what are the factors that influence happiness? These are topics that are now addressed with a very abundant scientific literature, and I offer you a brief overview of what we know on the subject. So by another definition, and then by seeing how it correlates, what do we mean by happiness, really, in essence? The literature is very extensive on the subject, but we will focus on two. Well-being, in English, translates as bien-être in French and is a measure at a given moment. People are asked, "Are you happy?" It is indeed obviously a subjective measure and one that captures the emotional and instantaneous aspects of happiness. And there is another measure which is life satisfaction, which is a bit different. It is an evaluation of happiness where people are asked to reflect a little bit more. They are asked on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being not happy at all, the absolute nightmare, and 10 being absolute nirvana. Where do you generally speaking stand? And so, there is indeed this idea of asking everyone what they think about it, which is quite subjective, but at the same time, we can see that it requires a different way of thinking. And the two do not always give the same results systematically, but in almost all the slides that I will present to you and the results that I have retained, it is life satisfaction that will be presented. The first message we see, and one reason why the knot is difficult to untie, is that life satisfaction is best correlated with money. The GDP, the richer a country is, the happier it is. This is true for countries and true for individuals. On average, the richer individuals are, the happier they are. Right? So, this is one of the reasons why economists are very attached to GDP and why, From the beginning, GDP has been considered a good means, a good indicator of a country's development and thus the quality of life of its inhabitants. But, from the very beginning, it has been a tool that is not at all suited to measuring sustainable prosperity. It presents numerous criticisms that have been made since its inception. GDP, by definition, is an indicator that quantifies the value of wealth production in a territory, that is, goods and services. However, it does not address the quality of life of individuals in particular. So it does not directly account for well-being in any significant way. It has other structural problems. If you destroy a hospital and then rebuild it, you increase the GDP. We can see that the interest for the community is quite limited. This is what we call taking negative activities into account. It does not account for activities, goods, and services that are not monetized. Everything that makes life enjoyable is not included in GDP. We have a measure that does not account for well-being. Conceived in the 1930s, when sustainability was not considered, so it also ignores sustainability. So we do have a problem. We have an indicator that does the job, but only halfway, and now it needs some help. To get back to the foundation of this, in essence, the best person to actually talk about it is its creator. Simon Kuznets, who was an economist who created the GDP in the 1930s following the 1929 depression, wrote that the well-being of a nation can hardly be inferred from a measure of national income, and the growth objectives must specify what and for whom. What are we growing and who are we growing it for? The concept of wealth is synonymous with production, but not necessarily with people's quality of life. So, there was another economist in the 70s who, quote-unquote, complimented this by saying that, in fact, beyond a certain threshold, the pursuit of increasing income or GDP per capita does not necessarily translate into an increase in the level of individual happiness. So, if we take the economic theories of Kuznets and Easterlin, we have a paradigm where GDP measures something that is both interesting and noteworthy, if only because it allows all states to communicate and exchange information on wealth and economic resources. On an individual level, there is a correlation that is good and positive at the beginning of economic development, but this correlation does not necessarily hold true in the long term or afterwards. So the fact that everyone agrees it's not a panacea has led to additional work and research to see how we could measure human wealth, quality of life, and human development differently, considering various factors and perspectives. And in the 1980s, several notable economists worked on complementary measures, such as the well-known one that was adopted by the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. It is the Human Development Indicator that was created by Amartya Sen and Mahbubul Haq, an Indian and a Pakistani who have been friends since they were together in school at Cambridge and who co-created this indicator, the HDI, Human Development Indicator, which essentially has three dimensions. The first point is that to be happy or to feel good, to develop, one needs money. So there is a GDP dimension involved. The second is that one must have a significant life expectancy and live in good health. This is the second. The third requires a good education level, measured here at 17 years old. So, it is essentially a three-dimensional composite indicator. And when we look at the overall correlation between GDP and the Human Development Indicator, we get a straight line. This makes it a development indicator that, rather than merely complementing GDP, provides the same information. The more money you have, the more developed you are. In essence, it indicates that financial wealth is a direct measure of development level. It's perfectly linear. Equatorial Guinea is indeed a little below, but fundamentally we have a distribution that is very, very close. This is quite different from the life satisfaction we saw earlier, where there is indeed a noticeable trend, but it is much less pronounced. So the Human Development Index accounts for very interesting things, but is indeed less comprehensive than the Life Satisfaction Index, in fact. So it's interesting to look at how this life satisfaction indicator behaves, how it is composed, and dig deeper, which is what researchers do, to see what lies behind it. And the first thing is that if we look at this graph, there's a little thing to know from a mathematical point of view, which is that the scale here is a logarithmic scale. What does it mean? It means you have 1,000 euros, $1,000, $10,000, $100,000. You went from a factor of 10 each time. You have a kind of line, or at least a distribution that trends like this in the form of a line. But if you now put it in a linear form and not logarithmic, then it's dollars as we count them today, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. What we observe is that the distribution grows very quickly, and then it stagnates. And essentially, fundamentally, Luxembourg is not, in fact, happier on average than the Netherlands or Switzerland. And yet, between the Netherlands and Luxembourg, there is a factor of 2. So, this is a first result that is very interesting when you look at it this way. Indeed, it is extremely important to have sufficient purchasing power, the necessary means to develop, especially in the very beginning, because the correlation is very, very strong and evident. And then, as we continue to make progress in gaining more and more purchasing power, we find that this sense of satisfaction does not increase in a straightforward or linear manner at all. Instead, it becomes clear that this is where we discover the Easterlin paradox. There is an increase up to a certain threshold, but beyond that, there are very few, if any, additional gains. So I have chosen a number of countries that we can couple and that provide another dimension. It's not only between 60,000 and 100,000. We saw that there was almost no difference, but at a given level of GDP per capita, the differences can be very significant. Between Zimbabwe and Nicaragua, with nearly the same GDP per capita, life satisfaction is twice as high. So money is, in fact, a part of happiness, but only a part. Between Botswana and Costa Rica, it's the same thing, as a matter of fact. Between France and Finland, there is a very important difference, even though we have exactly or almost the same purchasing power, because for the past 2 years, Finland has slightly taken the lead. However, France is significantly below Finland in terms of life satisfaction. Hong Kong, Denmark, Luxembourg, Singapore, etc. So, this is also something to take into account. We find other interesting things in this graph. This time, all nations are represented. And here, there is an effect that has been known for several decades now and remains very interesting to explore. There is a particular group of countries, those in green, which is Latin America. We see that with an equivalent GDP, Latin America is happier, even significantly happier. On average, the population is happier or significantly happier than the corresponding countries. Notably, here we have China. Between Costa Rica and China, there's no comparison, and yet they have the same GDP per capita. Another element that goes in the same direction is this one. This graph looks a bit complicated, but we will explore it together. Each ball with a line shows a country's 10-year trajectory, 2005, 2015, 2005, 2015, and so on. What we observe is that when a country develops and increases its GDP per capita, there is indeed an increase, in the case of China, in the level of life satisfaction of its inhabitants. But this is not the case in India, which, on the contrary, sees its level of satisfaction decrease. And we see, from a macro perspective, across all the countries represented here, that there is a lot of red. Not a majority, but there are indeed many red ones. This means that happiness does not systematically increase as economies develop. This is another element to say that there are plenty of other factors to consider. And so, it's a whole field of research that needs to be worked on because there are possibilities for decoupling between the happiness of the inhabitants and economic growth on the other hand. I will take 2 references to go a bit further and see what is in there. The first one is the World Happiness Report, which has been published every year for approximately at least 10 years now and lists the various different countries. Here, you have the 2020 ranking, but you have the ranking every year. It's always the same countries at the top, Finland, Denmark, and Switzerland. So the top 10 are roughly the same. It varies slightly from year to year, but it's not significant. If you're looking for France, it's approximately here. I believe this year it moved to the 20th position, and there you have it. In France, we are around the 20th position. And so we have a ranking of life satisfaction in terms of overall and general well-being and happiness of a country's inhabitants. I will come back to it because it is a comprehensive work that helps identify some of the factors contributing to this well-being. From a geographical point of view, this is a map representing the ranking we saw on the previous slide. in terms of geographical details. What we notice is that the countries where the inhabitants are most satisfied with their living conditions are represented here. Those who are less satisfied are represented there. And we see that, in general, with the exception of countries that are in very great difficulty, notably South Sudan and Afghanistan, living conditions are concentrated in a sort of average between 4 and 8. This corresponds to important teachings from another major global reference, namely the World Database of Happiness. The World Database of Happiness is a database of scientific articles on happiness, quality of life, satisfaction, etc. And so the founder, Ruud Veenhoven, wrote a comprehensive paper that extensively outlines the main findings of this research in detail and thoroughly. And I have listed 5 that surprised me when I read them. There are many others. I invite you to take a look at them. It's fascinating. The first thing is the majority of humanity enjoys life and unhappiness is the exception rather than the rule. It's indeed an interesting lesson when you consider the difference in development levels between various groups. The second point is that average happiness is indeed high in modern societies, which somewhat contradicts certain ideas about pessimism, consumerism, and a number of related topics. The third point is that in modern Western nations, happiness differs very little across social categories, between the rich and the poor, or between men and women. Well, in this case, it's indeed true that it's actually quite challenging for us to picture it. The fourth point is that people live happier in individualistic societies like Denmark than in collectivist societies like Japan. There are also many ideas suggesting that, in fact, individualism is actually truly associated with the degradation of society and, in reality, therefore to less collective happiness for everyone. And then, people are not happier and happiness inequalities are not lower in welfare states. If we compare the different states now, we will review the results of the World Happiness Report and describe to you what this color code is, which is what we understand to date about the different components of this life satisfaction that is measured this way. If we take the example of Finland, which is almost at 8, we have the dark blue part, which is the GDP, right here, for instance. Next, we have a lighter blue section that corresponds to what is commonly referred to as social support. Health, so we find the indicator that has served for human development. There is one indicator here that might be new, which is the freedom of choice. Next, generosity, the absence of corruption, and thus the quality of institutions. And then, a large purple section here, which I call other for simplicity, representing all the things that have not yet been attributed and are therefore extremely interesting. Here we have a kind of distribution of the main characteristics or key elements that we have identified in our study and research that make residents satisfied with their living conditions, and we will now look at some of them in more detail to understand the various factors that contribute to the overall satisfaction. We will start with social support, which is the importance of trust and relationships with others. With 3 lessons learned from the World Happiness Report earlier, the effects of trust on the inequality of well-being are very significant. In the same country, some people are very satisfied with their living conditions, while others are less so. If the level of trust is high in a country, this inequality tends to decrease. Reducing happiness inequalities can significantly increase the overall happiness of everyone in society, especially those who are the least happy in general. This inequality is decreasing. When it decreases, it particularly affects those who are the least happy. And anything that can increase social and institutional trust produces particularly significant benefits for people in difficulty, in great difficulty. This is partly the result of the first 2 factors, as trust reduces inequalities and has a significant systemic effect on those barely or not satisfied with their living conditions. And I think this is indeed an important lesson for us as French people, because Jan Algen and Pierre Cahut had shown as early as 2008, and unfortunately, they reiterated it 10 years later, showing that France is a country where trust is very, very low. So when they titled their book The Society of Distrust, it was to highlight how much our society lacks trust, especially when compared to other countries with the same GDP as ours. This is one of the notable differences between France and Finland. So here, in this figure, if we ask people whether it is possible to trust others, in countries like Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, 7 out of 10 times, people will answer yes. For us, it's approximately 1 out of 5, that's 0.2. It's 2 out of 10 instead of 7 out of 10. So we have a trust deficit, in quotes, in our modern society, and it's an extremely very important issue. There is another dimension of social cohesion or social support from a study conducted at Harvard, which started in 1938 and is not related to the World Happiness Report, where researchers, generations of researchers, have succeeded one another since 1938 to study the conditions of people's happiness. And they studied 724 young men in total in 1938. They weren't even actually interested in women's happiness. It's quite mind-blowing. It needs to be redone, so to speak, for a second cohort. But at least we have the information from this longitudinal study. Since 1938, people have been followed with questionnaires to find out if they were happy and with a whole battery of tests and questionnaires to try to evaluate what was changing in their lives. And they did this with people who had just entered Harvard University and people from an underprivileged neighborhood in Boston, Massachusetts as the control group. Because obviously, if you ask young, beautiful, and wealthy people what they think about life, you are more likely to get clearly biased opinions. What this study found is that the most important factor in both groups over the past 70 years is having very good relationships with close people. That is what truly leads to a good life and good health. So, this is another way to approach the subject. There is institutional trust, social trust, and the relationship with others. We indeed have something of the order of the social fabric and the quality of the social fabric, which is fundamental and determining for living conditions and quality of life. So, another very interesting result from another research study, this time indeed discusses not trust, but is about freedom, which is another component. Here, you have the countries that are represented here, such as France and Finland. France and Finland are there to help us have a reference. Here, you have freedom in your daily life. Are you truly satisfied with the freedom you have? And there, you have quality of life and overall, our satisfaction in life. There are people who, for example, feel very little freedom and are very unsatisfied, like in South Sudan or Haiti, and unfortunately, we understand why this is the case. And then, you have countries, for example, where there is low life satisfaction and yet they have great freedom, such as in some cases like Tanzania, and so on, etc. What we can clearly see is that across all these countries, there is a very large and evidently significant missing space. In fact, there are no countries that claim to be very satisfied with life, like those, without having at least a minimum of freedom or even significant freedom. So freedom is indeed a necessary condition, but it is not sufficient. Many countries do not feel adequately satisfied with their lives, but freedom remains a necessary condition. And it's indeed interesting to see that from this point of view, France also has a differential with Finland, both in terms of living conditions, which we have already seen, but also from a freedom perspective, since the French and the Finns consider they have total freedom in their choices and ways of doing things, while the French believe they still have a way to go. Now we are going to move into a completely different field, which is the impact of the environment. In particular, the 2020 World Happiness Report focused specifically on the quality of the environment and its impact on quality of life. Partly because, as you may have seen, Scandinavian countries are indeed at the top of the list where people report being the happiest. It turns out that these are people who are very connected to nature, and there is an important relationship. There is even a name for it in Norway, friluftsliv, but I don't know how to pronounce it, which is the art of connecting with nature. I just took a paper from Japan, which has nothing to do with it, but I think it illustrates the relationship between our well-being and the quality of the environment, which ultimately led to the creation of a dedicated and specialized scientific field, known as environmental psychology. We study the mechanisms by which the environment influences our psychology. As you may already know, in Japan, they often practice forest bathing. It's called Shinrin-yoku. I can't guarantee the pronunciation either. And forest bathing, people definitely go into the forest to feel better. There have been many studies conducted on this topic. This review evaluates all the criteria, everything that has been established by the literature on the subject, and finds positive effects on the cardiovascular system, the immune system, and the neuroendocrine system. Emotional regulation helps combat anxiety and depression, and facilitates healing in many cases. So, it's obvious to anyone who loves being in nature, but let's say that science, which is progressing nonetheless, is currently well establishing this very important relationship between a healthy environment and a significant quality of life, indeed. Here we find a fundamental concept that we previously discussed in the first part about One Health, which is promoted by the WHO, a healthy environment, a healthy nature, a healthy humanity, as promoted by the WHO. So I can't resist sharing this study with you because it is very important to me, as I am indeed particularly attached to biodiversity, especially birds, but it concerns everyone. It turns out that this comprehensive and detailed study, meticulously conducted, showed in 26 different countries among a diverse group of 26,000 adults that the overall quality of life or life satisfaction increased significantly with the noticeable increase in the number of various species in the residents' immediate environment. Whether they appreciate birds or not, it has been observed that Europeans tend to be happier and more content when they have a greater variety of bird species around them. This suggests that the presence of diverse bird species positively impacts their overall well-being and happiness. It's quite difficult to understand, at least for me, by what mechanism this happens, but this correlation indeed clearly shows that a healthy and truly rich environment brings great satisfaction, whether one is very interested in nature or not. It's an effect that we are not necessarily aware of, but it is illustrated and demonstrated in this article. To recap, by taking the 4 factors that I have detailed a little bit, and you will see why in a moment, life satisfaction largely depends on 4 factors we have seen: purchasing power, hence GDP per capita, trust and good relationships with others, the environment, and freedom of action, that is, the ability to act. And it turns out that these 4 dimensions are the ones retained by the World Policy Forum as a way to measure what could be a good appreciation of the goal to achieve for a country, for a community. Something balanced between solidarity, meaning social cohesion, trust, agency, GDP per capita, environment, we find our 4 dimensions. And what I find indeed even more interesting is that it is exactly the sum of 2 things that we really tend to very much oppose. Having empowerment, agency, freedom of action, and then money as fundamental values, which could indeed be considered neoliberal, is truly the way they express it here. These are the fundamental virtues of neoliberalism. And then it directly opposes the cardinal virtues of eco-solidarity, namely the environment and indeed solidarity, specifically. So on one side, in today's political landscape, we can quite easily and clearly see how groups and ideas are distributed according to these 2 categories in the current context. While the World Policy Forum indeed encourages us to look at how an integrated approach that truly combines these 4 dimensions could work, since they are, as we have just seen, all very important for the well-being of individuals and the cohesion of a community. So, we have just seen what the possible solutions are for developing prosperity indicators that are different from gross domestic product, GDP, and thus better measure life satisfaction and especially the conditions for, in fact, increasing prosperity. Now, we will quickly look at the indicators that can be used to see how economic activity can be decoupled from resources and environmental impacts. More quickly, why? Because there are indeed many of them and they have been around for a long time. We have already seen part of it. The first one that is obvious is everything related to the measurement of greenhouse gases, because climate change being what it is, a whole carbon accounting system has been created, a whole greenhouse gas accounting system, and these are now things that are measured by all countries and by a large number of stakeholders. This allows me to illustrate the concept of decoupling with a detailed and comprehensive example. In this specific and illustrative case, it is the decoupling between the economic production of Great Britain and the CO2 emissions that result from it, which can be counted in different ways, either what is produced within the territory, but what is more interesting is this one, because it takes into account the emissions that are imported when we have something built in China, for example. So here, we have had a decoupling since the 1990s, which was relative until 2007 or 2008, and then has become absolute since then. This trend is being observed in a growing number of countries. It's a very recent decoupling measure. but which is very encouraging. In this very comprehensive article published in the year 2019, the authors detailed and meticulously showed that there were a total of 18 countries, specifically 18 developed economies, that had achieved an absolute decoupling between their economic production and CO2 emissions. And in this graph from the Breakthrough Institute, which did additional, significant, complementary, and extensive work in the following 2 years, we went from 18 to 36 countries. This trend seems to be accelerating. While it's good news, we should note that some countries, like the United States, decoupled in the past but later recoupled due to changes in energy policy. So we will see all of this in more detail in the section dedicated to the decarbonization of the economy, particularly in energy production. But this is to illustrate to you that these decouplings, 1, are possible in certain cases, and 2, are now measurable because we have equipped ourselves with the tools to measure them. So what we have seen for CO2 should be applied to all greenhouse gases, and if you remember the planetary boundaries model, it should also be done for biodiversity, pollutants for the ether, etc. And then for all the materials we use. So it's not just a measure of 1 or 2 pollutants, it's something more integrated. And so there has been a lot of significant work done over the past 3 decades to try to accurately measure and correct or modify the gross domestic product, GDP. So this is what we called the green GDP, which some countries tested as early as the 1990s. It was quite promising, but then it turned out to be extremely complex and too difficult to use, and eventually it was abandoned. I'll just give you one example. In 2006, there were a lot of buzz around the fact that China was going to measure its growth with a green GDP. With a green GDP, that is, a GDP that would take into account not only its economic production but also the impact it has on its environment. So it was indeed a truly praiseworthy effort by China to, in fact, measure the reality of its growth. And they published a first report in 2004 showing the cost of environmental pollution in China, estimated at $64 billion, was 3% of the GDP. So they had approximate growth of around 7 or 8.5, or a third of it was consumed by environmental pollution. In any case, that's the information we have, because after that, the following year, the report didn't come out, and then in 2007, they announced that they wouldn't release it because the results were too politically complicated for them, but also because there were plenty of problems with the methodology, as I already mentioned, to properly measure and utilize these metrics effectively. But what is interesting, nonetheless, is that they continue to use it in various ways, even if they don't make official state publications. Chinese researchers use the green GDP data in their research to measure certain things, to gain insights into different aspects of economic and environmental performance, compare provinces, and compare economic sectors. So there is indeed something of that sort. But the United Nations have revised their approach and have released an enhanced green GDP, which they now call. This indeed comes from the framework. It is now called the Central Framework of the System of Environmental Economic Accounting, SEA, which was published in 2012. And here, it's no longer just about having a single indicator that does everything, because as we've seen, that's indeed a problem. It's more about having an accounting system that measures many various things and allows us to analytically track different resources and the various effects on ecosystems. And that, for once, seems to be catching on. We moved from a measurement indicator to a dashboard in our system. It has become a kind of international statistical standard, meaning that if a country wants to know where it stands on resource use and its environmental impacts, it can use this model, which is, quote-unquote, open source, that anyone can use. And most importantly, by doing so, it will enter the corresponding data into a database that the United Nations can compile. To date, there are more than 90 countries that compile their results in the SEA, which provides a lot of information on something much broader than GDP. Since this time, we also have effects on both resources and impacts. So there are many others, and I would just like to finish with 3. At the European level, as you know, the European Union has decided to give a big boost to the transition, which they call the Green Deal, and so they have equipped themselves with a dashboard of indicators. There are more than 20 of them. It ranges from greenhouse gases, R&D expenditures, and exposure to air pollution, among other factors. There are quite a few of them. They have created their own dashboards. We see that we are moving away from the idea that there would be a single figure for an indicator. It's more of a series in seeing what is easier. It's harder to manage, but more precise, since instead of one doing everything, we can easily see what the progress is in the different sectors and what the delays are in the different sectors. In France, we did it too. Indeed, in 2015, the year of the Paris Agreement, the new wealth indicators were released. So, it's worth detailing them. The employment rate, research effort, we also find this important notion, debt, healthy life expectancy, life satisfaction, things we've already seen, income inequality, poverty and living conditions, early school leaving, carbon footprint, and land artificialization. So here, there isn't just one indicator to complement GDP, there are 10, covering various different issues that are social, environmental, and forward-looking aspects, such as research effort, debt, and whether we have the necessary conditions to move forward in the future. This is a French initiative. There is another one that is quite interesting because it is even more extreme in its approach. It's the budget of New Zealand that they call the well-being budget, which the government of New Zealand has been creating since the year 2019. Has focused its actions and initiatives around major themes that seem important to them for people's well-being. So they are no longer focused on economic growth objectives, or at least not solely, or at least not directly in any way whatsoever. Their main objectives are to take care of the mental health of populations by providing necessary resources and support, increase the well-being of young people through various programs and initiatives, and support work on indigenous populations to ensure comprehensive care and assistance. So they have 3 associated economic indicators: how to build a productive nation, transform the economy, and also facilitate investment. But they have a dashboard. Well, they have developed an approach with a dashboard that is not simply tied to economic growth as measured by GDP. And finally, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are represented here with the tracking system done in collaboration with our world in data. We also moved from a logic. We remember there was the GDP, then there was the Human Development Index. In the 2000s, we started with the Millennium Development Goals, figuring out how to lift people out of poverty and ensure decent development for everyone. And now, since 2015, we have a set of 17 major goals, each with a whole list of indicators, which makes it way too complicated. I certainly won't go into detail, but it's to say that we are indeed moving away from the logic of a single indicator. To transition from this economic growth to sustainable prosperity, there is a need to complement the indicator as we knew it, and there are various initiatives to do so. To summarize, there is currently an abundance of indicators, an abundance of methods, and a lot of research being conducted, especially in the fields related to well-being and alternative measurement methods. And we can focus on these 4 elements. We all share a common goal, which is that we should try to shift from a logic of economic growth to a logic of developing prosperity. For that, we can try to refocus on developing the components of quality of life that do not depend, or depend very little, on material production. That is to say, in essence, trying to see exactly which topics we can significantly improve the quality of life for people, without having to develop new energy infrastructures, extract materials, or pollute. And then, as for the remaining costs, what needs to be done now is to take into account the impacts on resources and the environment, promote regenerative practices, which we will also see in the following videos, and ultimately, transform accounting and financial principles to integrate social and natural capital. Something that must not simply be research indicators or used by a few institutions. It must be embedded in the very fundamental principles of national accounting. It must be embedded in the very essential principles of accounting for institutions, organizations, and businesses. It's another way of seeing the world. It's another way of counting. It's moving from what we count to who counts and ensuring we have the right means to do it.